The last harvest. 3 weeks before the harvest that would either save his vineyard or lose it forever. Nathaniel Carver walked his rows at dawn and found that overnight someone had poisoned the soil at the head of every vine. And standing there in the gray light with the smell of it in his nose, he understood that the man who had smiled at him at the growers' dinner had decided he would rather kill the whole valley's respect for Nate than lose to him. If you have ever built something beautiful out of dirt and patience and years of your own sweat, only to watch a powerful neighbor try to destroy it out of pure wounded pride, then you already know the kind of cold that settled into Nate's chest that morning. Stay with me all the way to the last pour, because the way Nate saves his harvest and brings down the man who tried to ruin him is going to have you cheering. And if you love a story where the outsider who earned everything beats the insider who inherited it, hit that subscribe button right now, because this one is worth every minute. Let me take you back so you understand exactly what they tried to destroy. Nathaniel Carver was 40 years old, and he made wine the way his grandfather had grown collard greens, with a patience that looked like love, because it was. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders from 20 years of vineyard work with earth permanently under his nails and a slow, considering way of speaking that made people trust him before they knew why. He had a palate that the old winemakers of the valley, the ones who would never say it out loud, privately admitted was the best any of them had encountered, an almost frightening ability to taste a wine and know not just what it was, but what it wanted to become. He could walk a row of vines and read the soil through the leaves. He could taste a grape in August and know exactly what the wine would be the following spring. It was a gift. And like all real gifts, it had been paid for with a lifetime of work, because Nathaniel Carver had not been born into wine. Almost no one who looked like him was not in that valley, not anywhere. He had grown up in the flatlands of California's Central Valley, the son of farm workers people who had spent their lives picking other people's crops for wages that never added up to a life. He had worked the fields himself as a young man, and he had noticed in the vineyards where he sometimes labored that the men who owned the land and drank the wine treated the people who grew it as invisible as hands without minds. And he had decided with the quiet stubbornness that would define him that one day he would own the land and make the wine and prove that the knowledge lived in the hands all along. He had started at the bottom as a cellar rat washing barrels, and he had made himself indispensable, then respected, then slowly undeniable. He had studied at night. He had saved every dollar. He had apprenticed himself to a great old winemaker named Sophia Reyes, who had seen the gift in him and taught him everything. Sophia had been an outsider too, a woman winemaker in an era that had even less room for one than Nate's had for him. And she had recognized in the young cellar rat the same thing that had been used against her all her life, a talent so large it made the established people uncomfortable. She had taken him under her wing and taught him not only the craft but the harder lesson beneath it, that the valley would let him in only as far as he forced it to, that his wine would have to be so undeniable that even the people who wished he did not exist would have to admit its greatness. "They will never give it to you," she had told him near the end, her hands too weak by then to hold a glass. "You will have to make something so true they cannot look away. And when you do, some of them will hate you for it, because you will have proven that everything they inherited you earned. Do not let that stop you. That hatred is just the sound of you being right." She had made him promise not to waste the gift, and he had kept that promise through 20 years and a poisoned harvest, and he would keep it for the rest of his life. And then after 20 years, he had done the impossible. He had bought a small, run-down, overlooked vineyard on a hillside that everyone said was worthless. Stony, difficult patch of ground that the big estates had passed over. He had poured everything he had into it, every dollar and every year, and he had done with that neglected dirt what no one believed could be done. He had made wine from it, wine of such startling beauty that the critics who tasted it, blind not knowing who had made it, had gone quiet and then reached for words they usually saved for the legends. Nate Carver's little hillside vineyard, Sophia's Hill, he'd named it after his mentor, was on the verge of becoming the most talked about wine in the valley, and that in a place ruled by old money and old bloodlines was a problem for a certain kind of man. Because there was a man named Preston Ashford Vane, and Preston Ashford Vane could not abide it. Preston owned the valley's grandest and oldest estate, Ashford Cellars, a sprawling operation with a stone chateau, a wall of gold medals, and a lineage that went back 4 generations. He was old money, valley royalty, a silver-haired man with a collector's tan, and the frictionless charm of someone who has never once been told no. He was by reputation a gentleman of wine, a patron of the valley, a fixture at every charity gala. And underneath all of it, where no camera looked, he was a man who believed with the untroubled certainty of the truly entitled that great wine was a birthright, his birthright, and that the sudden emergence of a farm worker's son making better wine than Ashford cellars from a hillside. Preston had once dismissed as garbage was not a triumph to be celebrated, but an offense to be corrected. It had started as these things do, with a small humiliation. At a blind tasting the previous year, a prestigious one, Nate's wine from Sophia's Hill had beaten Ashford Cellars' flagship decisively in front of the entire Valley's establishment. Preston had smiled through at the gracious loser and had come up to Nate afterward and shaken his hand and said all the right things. But Preston Ashford Vane had gone home that night with a wound that would not close, because a man who believes greatness is his birthright cannot survive being beaten by a man he considers his inferior. And a wound like that in a man with that much power and that little conscience does not heal. It festers into a plan. Which brings us to the poisoned soil 3 weeks before harvest. But before I tell you what that poison threatened, let me introduce you to the person who would become the most important in Nate's life, and who was that same season driving up the valley in a dusty rental car with a reputation for being impossible to fool, and a growing suspicion that the wine world she'd built her career on was rotten in places she was only beginning to see. Her name was Clare Donnelly. She was 36, one of the most respected wine critics in the country. With copper-red hair, she kept tied back and shrewd green eyes that had tasted their way through every great cellar in the world. She had grown up in New England, the daughter of a restaurateur, and she had come up in the wine world the hard way, as a woman in a field of men who assumed she was decorative learning to trust nothing but her own palate, which turned out to be extraordinary. She had built her reputation on one thing above all: she could not be bought, and she could not be fooled. She scored wine blind on its merits, and she had ended more than one overhyped reputation and made more than one unknown one, and she was feared and respected in exactly equal measure, and she had come to the valley that season chasing a rumor. The rumor of a wine from a hillside that wasn't supposed to be able to make anything made by a man, the establishment talked about in careful lowered voices. She had no idea driving up that dusty road that the winemaker she'd come to find would change the entire course of her life. And Nate had no idea that the critic everyone feared would one day be the only person with the standing and the courage to help him prove the truth when the whole valley had closed ranks. Here is what the poisoned soil threatened. A vineyard is not a factory. You cannot simply replant and try again next quarter. The vines on Sophia's Hill were the accumulated work of years, and the harvest 3 weeks away was the one that mattered, the vintage that the critics were waiting for, the wine that would either establish Sophia's Hill forever or, if it failed, send Nate back into the debt that had nearly swallowed him buying the land. Nate had borrowed heavily everything he had and more, betting it all on this harvest. And now at the head of every row, someone had introduced a poison into the soil, designed to stress the vines at exactly the wrong moment, to ruin the fruit just before it ripened, to make the great vintage collapse into a worthless one. It was precise, and it was knowledgeable, the work of someone who understood viticulture intimately, and it was aimed to look to any casual observer like a natural failure, like the hillside simply proving the doubters right at last. Nate knelt in the dirt that gray morning and smelled the poison and understood two things at once: that this was sabotage, and that if the valley found out his vines were failing, no one would believe it was anything but the inevitable collapse of a farm worker's son who'd reached beyond his station. The story would write itself the way it always did. Sophia's Hill had been a fluke, a flash in the pan, and now the dirt had reverted to what everyone always knew it was. Preston Ashford Vane had not just poisoned the soil. He had poisoned the story in advance so that Nate's ruin would look like the natural order reasserting itself. Now, before I tell you how Nate fights back, because the way he does it will make you want to stand up and cheer, let me remind you to hit that subscribe button, because the comeback is where this story truly begins. Nate did the first thing a serious man does. He tried to save the vines. He worked around the clock, he and his small crew, the loyal few who had believed in Sophia's Hill from the start, flushing the soil, treating the vines, doing everything 20 years of knowledge could suggest. And some of it worked partially, but the damage was done to enough of the crop that the great vintage he'd been counting on was in mortal danger. And worse, he now faced a second problem because he could not prove sabotage. The poison was subtle. An investigator, if the valley even took him seriously enough to send one, would find a vineyard in distress and no obvious cause, and the presumption would fall exactly where Preston had aimed it, on Nate's own supposed inexperience. And here is where the cruelty deepened, because Preston Ashford Vane, having wounded the vines, now moved to profit from the wound. Nate was leveraged to the hilt, his loan secured against the vineyard, and Preston, through intermediaries, quietly began positioning to buy Sophia's Hill out of the bankruptcy that a failed harvest would trigger. He would get the hillside he'd once dismissed, now proven capable of greatness for pennies, and he would erase the farm worker's son who had embarrassed him, and he would do it all while wearing the gracious smile of a valley patron, helping a neighbor through hard times. It was elegant, and it was vicious, and it was working. The weeks that followed nearly broke him. Nate watched his life's work hang in the balance, watched the vintage he'd bet everything on teeter on the edge of ruin, and felt the old darkness close over him, the one he'd known as a young man in the fields. The voice that whispered that people like him were meant to pick the grapes, not own the vines that he'd been a fool to reach so high. He stopped sleeping. The debt letters piled up. And the valley, sensing weakness, the way it always did, began to talk. The careful lowered voices now carrying a note of vindication. They'd always known Sophia's Hill couldn't last. The lowest moment came at the valley's Harvest Festival, an event he almost didn't attend but forced himself to because to stay away would have been to concede. He stood at the edge of the crowd and watched Preston Ashford Vane hold court, gracious and golden, accepting the deference of the whole valley, and he heard drifting from a knot of established winemakers. The careful lowered voices saying what they'd always wanted to say, that Sophia's Hill had been a fluke, that the dirt had finally shown its true colors, that it was almost a mercy. Preston was willing to take the failing vineyard off the poor man's hands. Nate had stood in that crowd, a glass of someone else's mediocre wine going warm in his hand, and felt the full weight of a valley that had never wanted him, and was now at last getting to be right about him. He drove home that night to his distressed rows and sat among the vines in the dark and thought for the first time in 20 years that maybe they had always been right, that maybe a farm worker's son was only ever meant to grow the grapes and never to own the hill, that everything he'd built had been borrowed and was now being repossessed by the people who'd always been meant to have it. He put his hand on the poisoned soil and nearly wept. What he did not know, sitting in that dark among his wounded vines, was that a woman who could not be fooled was already driving up the valley toward him, chasing a rumor about the best wine no one could explain. And then Clare Donnelly walked into his tasting room. She had come to taste the wine that had beaten Ashford's cellars. She found instead a man at the end of his rope in a vineyard in visible distress, and Clare Donnelly, who could not be fooled, took one look at the stressed vines and one taste of a barrel sample of the previous vintage, and knew two things immediately: that the man in front of her was one of the greatest winemakers she had ever encountered, and that something about the sudden failure of his vineyard did not smell right. She had spent her career learning to tell the difference between a wine that fails because the maker lacks skill and a wine that fails for reasons that have nothing to do with skill. And every instinct she had honed over 20 years told her that what was happening on Sophia's Hill was not natural. "I've tasted 10,000 wines," she said, standing in his distressed rows. "I know the difference between a man who can't and a vineyard that's been made to fail. Your last vintage is one of the best things I've put in my mouth in a decade." Vines don't forget how to make wine like that in a single season. Something happened here. She looked at him direct and unflinching. "So I'm going to ask you one question, and I need the truth. Did your vineyard fail, or did someone make it fail?" Nate looked at this woman, this stranger, with a palate that couldn't be fooled and a certainty that matched the one he'd been carrying alone. And for the first time since the gray morning, he did not feel crazy. "Someone poisoned my soil," he said. 3 weeks before harvest, every row, and I can't prove it." Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Then we're going to prove it, because I did not build a career on telling the truth about wine to stand here and watch someone bury the best winemaker in this valley under a lie. I want to be honest with you because I promised this story would earn its ending. That night was not the beginning of a romance. It was the beginning of an investigation, and a dangerous one, because they were about to go up against the most powerful man in the valley, a man whose family had ruled it for a century. Clare, it turned out, had resources. Nate didn't. She knew the wine world from the top down, the way Nate knew it from the bottom up, and between her connections and his knowledge of the land, they had something Preston had never accounted for. The romance would come slowly, forged in the long nights, over soil samples and old grudges, the way the truest things do. But for now, there was only the work, and the work led them step by careful step toward a truth big enough to bring down a dynasty. The nights of that investigation became something neither of them had expected. They worked in Nate's small tasting room after the crew had gone home, soil reports on one side of the old oak table and Clare's laptop on the other, and slowly the work became more than the work. Clare told him about New England, about a restaurateur father who taught her that a meal like a wine is an honest thing, or it is nothing, and about the long apprenticeship of being a woman in a wine world that assumed she was decorative until her palate made that impossible, about learning to trust nothing but what she could taste. Nate told her things he'd told almost no one about the fields, about his parents' backs bent over other people's crops, about the invisible feeling of being a pair of hands. To men who drank the wine, those hands had grown about Sophia Reyes and the duty she'd laid on him. They discovered they were the same kind of person, two people who had each been underestimated their whole lives and had answered by becoming impossible to dismiss. And the long nights began to feel less like a burden and more like the first place either of them had ever fully belonged. One night, Clare fell asleep in the tasting room chair over a stack of lab results, and Nate laid a barrel blanket over her and sat listening to the vines tick and settle in the dark, and understood that the thing he was fighting for had quietly grown larger than his vineyard. He set the thought aside because there was a powerful man to bring down, and he'd learned over a lifetime of closed doors not to reach for good things until he was sure they'd survive the reaching. But he noticed. He definitely noticed. There was help, too, from the people Nate had earned over a hard life. His small crew, the loyal few, worked themselves to exhaustion to save what could be saved of the vines and asked for nothing. The old winemakers of the valley, the ones who would never say out loud that Nate's palate was the best among them, quietly sent advice cuttings a spare tank when he needed one. Small mercies that told him not everyone in that valley had bent the knee to Preston. And the farm workers, the invisible hands of 100 vineyards, the people Nate had never stopped being one of, became something powerful. When word spread of what was being done to Sophia's Hill, they knew things, saw things, remembered which crews had done odd night work, wherein they passed it all quietly toward the one man among the valley's owners who had come from among them. Nate had never forgotten where he came from, and now at his lowest, the people he came from built a foundation back under him. That was the thing Preston never understood and never could, that a man who never pretends to be better than the people who do the work earns a loyalty no dynasty can buy. Now here is where the story turns, so if you're rooting for them, hit that subscribe button because the investigation is about to find something that changes everything. They started with the soil. Nate had, out of pure instinct on that gray morning, taken samples before he began treating the vines, bagged and dated them, because some part of him had known even then that he would need proof. Clare knew a soil scientist at a university viticulture program, a meticulous woman named Dr. Okafor, who had no love for the valley's old money and every interest in the truth. The analysis came back damning the soil contained a specific compound, an agricultural chemical not used in organic viticulture, introduced artificially in a pattern no natural process could explain. It was, in scientific terms, a smoking gun. Someone had poisoned Sophia's Hill deliberately. That alone turned Nate's story from the excuse of a failing farmer into a documented crime. But proving it was poison was not the same as proving who did it, and Preston had been careful. So Clare and Nate pulled the second thread, and it led exactly where Nate suspected. The specific compound was unusual, specialized, the kind of thing purchased through agricultural suppliers who kept records. And when they traced it quietly through Clare's connections and a sympathetic supplier who remembered an odd order, the trail led to a vineyard management company that did contract work across the valley, and through that company to a foreman who had, it turned out, done a great deal of off-the-books work for Ashford Cellars. The man who had poisoned the soil was traceable, and the hand that had hired him led toward Preston. And then they found the pattern, because Clare, being Clare, did not stop at Nate's case. She started asking questions about Ashford Cellars, and what she found was that Preston Ashford Vane had a long, quiet history of destroying rivals who threatened him. Other small winemakers over the years who had begun to shine, and who had then suffered mysterious failures. Bad luck ruined vintages and had sold out cheap to Ashford cellars, which had absorbed their vineyards one by one. It was not one act of sabotage. It was a decades-long pattern, a dynasty built not only on inheritance, but on the systematic destruction of anyone who dared to make better wine than the birthright allowed. And a pattern that long leaves a trail of victims, and victims, when they finally find each other, are not powerless anymore. But Preston Ashford Vane was not a man who lost quietly, and when he sensed that someone was pulling the thread, he moved to crush them. The first blow was aimed at Clare. Word reached Preston that the famous critic was asking questions, and Preston had influence in the wine world that ran deep. Suddenly, Clare's integrity, her whole professional identity, came under attack. Whispers that she had a conflict of interest, that she was romantically involved with a winemaker she was covering, that her judgment was compromised. A prestigious publication she wrote for got nervous. The Valley establishment, closing ranks around its king, moved to discredit the one critic whose word could not otherwise be doubted. The second blow was aimed at Nate, and it was worse. With his harvest damaged and his debt crushing, Preston's intermediaries accelerated, calling in pressure on Nate's lenders, engineering a demand for immediate repayment that Nate could not possibly meet, designed to force the vineyard into foreclosure before the truth could come out. And Preston added a threat aimed at Nate's crew, the loyal few, letting it be known that anyone who stood with Nate Carver would never work in the Valley again. That the Valley's estates would blacklist them, that loyalty to a failing farm worker's son would cost them their livelihoods. One of Nate's crew, a young viticulturist named Miguel, who had been with him from the start, came to him torn apart. "I believe in you, Nate," he said, "but they're saying none of us will ever work in this valley again. I've got a life here. I don't know if I can afford to go down with the ship." And Nate, who understood better than anyone what it cost a working person to defy the powerful, told him the truth. "Then don't, Miguel. Protect yourself and your family. I'll never think less of you. I've been where you are. I know what that fear costs." He meant it. He would rather have lost the vineyard than watched Preston grind down the people who'd trusted him. But here's the thing about a man who refuses to let his own fight cost the people around him. It makes those people willing to go down with the ship. Miguel looked at Nate, at a man being crushed who was still trying to protect him, and he made his choice. "No," he said. "If I walk away to protect myself, then he wins, and he keeps doing this to every one of us who ever tries to rise. I'd rather go down standing with you than keep a job by helping him bury you." The rest of the crew said the same. And so did something Preston never saw coming: the other victims, the winemakers he'd destroyed over the years. When Clare found them and told them the truth, began to come forward one by one, emboldened by no longer being alone. Now here is where it all comes together. So before I give you the reckoning, let me ask you one more time. If you're on the edge of your seat, if you want to see Preston Ashford Vane get exactly what he has earned, hit that subscribe button, because it is time for the last pour. Nate and Clare understood they could not win this inside the Valley, where Preston's influence over the establishment, the press, and the local institutions was total. They needed to take the crime, the sabotage, the poisoning, the pattern to authorities who did not answer to Ashford cellars, and they needed to make it public and undeniable in the same stroke. Poisoning a rival's land is not a matter of Valley politics. It is a crime, agricultural sabotage, and worse, and criminal authorities do not care whose family has ruled the Valley for a century. But first they needed the foreman, the man who had actually applied the poison, because he was the human link in the chain, and human links, when they realize they're about to be the fall guy, will talk. Nate went to him himself, and he did not threaten him, because Nate understood exactly what it was to be a working man doing what a powerful man ordered. "You put the poison in my ground," Nate said quietly, "but you didn't decide to. He did. And right now you're the only name anybody can prove. When this comes down, and it's coming down, he'll let you take all of it while he sails off clean. That's what men like him do to men like us. The only way you don't spend your life paying for his crime is to tell the truth before he finishes hanging it on you." The foreman, who had been sick with it for weeks, who had a family and a conscience and no illusions about how Preston Ashford Vane treated the people who did his dirty work, broke. He had records. He had been paid through the management company in a way that could be traced. He named Preston. Preston made one last move, and it was the most dangerous of all. Sensing the trap, closing, he tried to make the problem disappear the way powerful men do when charm and sabotage have both failed. He came to Nate himself in person, all warmth and grave concern, and made him an offer wrapped around a threat. He would buy Sophia's Hill at a generous price, a fair price, more than fair enough to clear Nate's debts and set him up handsomely, and he would even, he said magnanimously, keep the Sophia's Hill name on a label as a tribute. In exchange, Nate would sign away the land, drop his unfortunate accusations, and let the valley return to peace. And if he refused, Preston let the threat show through the smile. For just an instant, the foreclosure would proceed. The crew would be blacklisted, and Nate would lose everything anyway and get nothing for it. It was a bribe and a threat in a single breath, and it was aimed at the exhaustion of a man who had already nearly lost it all. Nate looked at the offer, which was more money than his parents had earned in their entire lives bent over other people's crops. And he thought about them, and about Sophia, and about the invisible hands that had grown 100 vintages for men like Preston, and he shook his head. "You poisoned my ground, Preston, and now you want to buy it clean," he said. "No, the dirt's not for sale, and neither am I, and you should know the truth's already in the soil. I sent samples out weeks ago." Preston's smile finally cracked just slightly, and in that crack, Nate saw that he'd guessed right, that the offer had been fear wearing the mask of generosity. The meeting had been recorded because Claire had insisted, and Preston's attempt to buy the land and buy Nate's silence became one more piece of a case that was already overwhelming. It came down all at once. The soil analysis, the supply trail, the foreman's testimony, the pattern of destroyed rivals, the recorded attempt to buy Nate off, all of it went to the authorities and to a major investigative outlet at the same time. The story broke at the height of the Valley's social season and detonated the aristocrat of wine, the gracious patron, exposed as a man who had built and defended his dynasty for decades by poisoning the land of anyone who dared to make better wine than his birthright. The other victims came forward. The whispers against Claire were exposed as exactly what they were: a smear campaign traced back to Ashford Seller's own machinery. The engineered foreclosure was frozen the moment the sabotage became documented fact. Preston Ashford Vane's world collapsed with the speed that only a scandal in a small, proud world can deliver. His medals meant nothing. His lineage meant nothing. The valley that had crowned him turned on him overnight, because even the old money could not be seen standing beside a man who poisoned the earth. He was charged with agricultural sabotage, fraud, conspiracy, and a string of related crimes, and the case against him, built by outside authorities and corroborated by the foreman and the pattern of victims, was overwhelming. He lost his estate, his reputation, his freedom, and the name his family had polished for a century. The last thing Nate ever said to him as the valley's fallen king was led away was quiet and even. "You could have just made better wine, Preston. You had everything you needed and you spent it poisoning the ground instead. That's the thing about dirt. It remembers what you put in it." But this story was never really about Preston. Villains are just the frost that kills the bud. The story was always about the harvest and the man who knew how to bring it in. Because here is the part that mattered most. Nate saved the harvest. Not all of it, but enough, because the samples he'd flushed and the vines he'd fought to save, combined with 20 years of knowing exactly what that hillside could do, let him bring in a vintage from the surviving fruit that was against all odds extraordinary. The saving of it was the hardest winemaking Nate had ever done, and it drew on everything Sophia Reyes had ever taught him. With a fraction of the healthy fruit he'd counted on, he had to make choices in the cellar that no formula could guide, sorting berry by berry, adjusting by taste and instinct, coaxing structure and depth out of grapes that had survived a poisoning. He barely slept for the length of the crush. The crew worked beside him around the clock, and Claire, who had tasted the greatest wines in the world but had never watched one being fought into existence, stood in the cellar through the long nights and understood that she was witnessing something. She had only ever tasted the result of genius under pressure, a man wringing beauty out of near ruin. When the final blend came together late one night and Nate held out a glass to her without a word, she tasted it and had to sit down because it was not merely good. It was the best thing he had ever made, forged in the worst season of his life, proof that the poison had failed at the one thing Preston most wanted, which was to prove that Sophia's Hill had never been real. And Clare Donnelly, whose word could not be bought, and once the smear was exposed, could not be doubted, tasted it blind among a field of the valley's finest, and scored it higher than any wine she had reviewed that year, and told the whole world that Sophia's Hill had made a wine for the ages under conditions that would have destroyed anyone with less than genius. The vineyard Preston had tried to steal for pennies became the most celebrated in the valley. The foreclosure was reversed, and Nate Carver, the farm worker's son, stood at the top of a valley that had always looked down on him, holding a glass of wine made from a hillside. Everyone said was worthless dirt. He had turned into something the legends reached for words to describe. And Claire, it grew slowly, exactly the way I promised. Through all those nights, over soil samples and old grudges, through the smears and the fear and the fight, something had been building between them that neither had let themselves name while there was a vineyard to save. They were two people who had each spent a lifetime being underestimated and had answered by becoming undeniable, one from the fields and one from the tasting rooms, and they had recognized each other from the very first day. But it was only after it was over, after the reckoning and the harvest, when the last of the crush was in the barrels and it was just the two of them standing in the rows at dusk, that Nate finally said it. "You walked into my tasting room when the whole valley was ready to write me off," he said. "You put your reputation on the line, the one thing you'd never let anyone touch, to prove the truth about my dirt." He looked at her. "I've spent my whole life growing things for other people to enjoy. I don't think I ever expected somebody to fight this hard to protect what I grew." Claire, who had built a career on refusing to be fooled or bought, looked at him and said, "I've tasted the finest things the world has to make, Nate, and you're the truest one I've found. I wasn't going to let them bury that. And somewhere in the middle of proving it, I stopped being able to imagine leaving." He kissed her in the rose at dusk, with the smell of the crush in the air and the hillside gold around them, and it felt like the first taste of a wine you know is going to be great. They built a life together after that, two people who understood that the finest things are made slowly from patience and truth. Claire kept reviewing, and her word grew only more trusted, and she used it to seek out and champion the winemakers. The establishment overlooked the ones from the wrong families and the wrong backgrounds, who made great wine and had no one to tell the world. Nate ran Sophia's Hill for decades, and it became a place that proved vintage after vintage that greatness comes from the hands and the land and the patience, not from bloodlines. He hired the foreman who had poisoned his soil once the man had served his reckoning and shown his remorse, because Nate believed that a man who tells the truth against his own interest deserves a second chance, and because he understood that the foreman had been like Nate himself once, was a working man caught in a powerful man's machine. And he started a program funded by the Vineyard's success that trained young people from farm-working families, the ones who had grown up in the valley's fields in viticulture and winemaking, opening the doors that had been closed to him so that the next Nate Carver would not have to spend 20 years proving he was allowed to own the land. He named it after Sophia Reyes, the mentor who had told him he had a duty not to waste his gift. His parents, farm workers who had spent their lives picking other people's crops, lived to see their son own the most celebrated vineyard in the valley and pour his wine for the people who had once treated their kind as invisible. At the first great release of Sophia's Hill after the scandal, Nate poured the first glass for his mother before the critics, before anyone, and told the assembled valley that everything he had ever grown, he had grown, because two people who worked the fields had raised a son to believe the knowledge lived in the hands all along. She wept. So did half the valley. They married in the vineyard, of course, at harvest among the heavy vines with Miguel and the loyal crew and Dr. Okafor and dozens of the working people whose lives Sophia's Hill had changed, and someone had hung a banner among the rows that read in plain letters the words that had gotten them there: "The dirt remembers." They tried to destroy Nathaniel Carver by poisoning the very ground he'd built his life on, certain that a farm worker's son would have no way to prove the truth and no one to stand beside him. They forgot that a man who knows the land the way Nate knew it does not give up on it just because someone poisons it, and they never imagined that the one critic who could not be fooled would decide his truth was worth her whole career. Every vine they tried to kill, he fought to save. Every lie they buried in his soil, the dirt itself remembered. And in the end, he had more than his harvest and his vineyard and his cleared name. He had a valley remade a little in his favor, and a program opening doors for the young people of the fields, and a partner who had proven the truth of him before she ever let herself love him, and the deep, unshakable knowledge that the hillside everyone said was worthless had made under his hands a wine for the ages. Preston Ashford Vane had bet his dynasty on the belief that greatness was a birthright, something you inherited and defended, and when necessary protected by poisoning anyone who proved otherwise. He was wrong because he never understood the one thing Sophia Reyes had known and taught, that real greatness cannot be inherited or bought or poisoned away. Only earned in the dirt with the hands over years by someone patient and stubborn enough to coax it out of ground that everyone else gave up on. That is the story of the last harvest, which turned out not to be the last at all, but the first of a long line of great vintages from a hill that a farm worker's son turned into a legend. If this story got to you, if you cheered when Preston was led away and smiled when Nate finally kissed the critic who fought for his truth, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, tell me in the comments the moment that got you, and share this with someone who needs to hear that the ones who earn everything from nothing can be knocked down, but not buried, because the dirt remembers, and so does the truth. Because greatness that comes from the hands and the land cannot be poisoned out of existence, no matter how much money a man pours into the ground trying. The vine that survives the poison makes the truest wine of all, and the man who tends it with honest hands will always, in the end, outlast the one who only knows how to take. I'll see you at the next harvest.